Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Autumn and today I want to talk to you about the books I've read recently. I have a cute little stack right over here that I'm very excited to talk about today. So let's go ahead and jump into it. The first book I want to talk about is Malice by John Gwynne. This book follows a very wide cast of characters. There are a few characters listed on the back, but these are not all of the characters. This book follows a huge war between giants and men that basically had obliterated this world. So it's thousands of years later, this world has learned to deal with the scars that were left behind from this huge war, and it is prophesied that that war will happen again. This book is the start, like the very start of that prophecy starting to come to life. You are seeing all sides of this war. All of these characters are on different sides, or you're not quite sure who is on the right side, like the good side, who's on the bad side. And this book is just so good. It is beautifully written. The pacing in this is just chef's kiss. The characters in this, you get, like I said, this huge wide variety of characters. I think this author did a fantastic job with creating all of these characters and making them all so different. You fall in love with some of these characters. Some of these characters that you don't like, that you're supposed to not like, are just written so well. I mean, it is just a phenomenal start to a 4-book series. I will be continuing this series. This is all I have to say so far about Malice. I finished it. It was a 5-star read for me. I cannot talk more highly of this book. I just talked about a book that I absolutely really loved. Now I'm gonna swing the other direction and talk about a book I did not really care for, and it is called A Door in the Dark by Scott Rankin. So this book follows our main character Ren. She lives in this dystopian world. It kind of makes me feel like a caste system where you have the really rich people who are like the founding families, and then you have the poorer side of town, which is where Ren comes from. And she is in university at this school of magic. So she and a friend of hers are going into this portal, and it's like a subway system. So you go into this portal and there are candles all around, and once the candles burn down, they'll teleport you to where you need to go. She's in there with one of her friends and a couple of other people from her class that she knows, but they don't quite get along. An argument breaks out, a fight starts, and before they know it, once that candle burns down, they get pretty much yeeted out into the wilderness, and they have no way to get home unless they band together and try to make it through the wilderness and get back to society. This book had a very interesting magic system. I think the magic was intriguing, but honestly, I don't feel like the author had a really solid understanding of his own magic system, because there were some of the things that happened in this book that I felt were plot holes and then just duct taped fixed. It was a pretty disappointing read for me, and not even just because of the magic system. I felt like most of the characters in this book were just not the best. They felt very cardboard, very cookie cutter. I did not care for any of the characters. I did not like to be in the head of our main character. She was just a mean person, and I just couldn't connect with her. Whenever anything would happen to any of the other characters, it was just like, oh, okay. Well, that was fun. I didn't really feel connected to anybody. This is the start of a series, I think. I don't know how many books follow this, but I will not be continuing this series. It's not really for me. It's not really my jam. It is YA, but I think it's YA. But honestly, it reads very young, even though these characters are in university, so I'm assuming they're like 21, 22, and they just read so incredibly young, almost like they were 14 and 15 years old. So I also had a hard time connecting with the characters because of just the writing style and just like the tone of the story. So this book was very disappointing. I wouldn't be surprised if it was my most disappointing read of 2024. I ended up giving this book 2 stars. The next book up on this list is The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. It was a library book. I buddy read this book with my mom. We had a lot of fun buddy reading this. The synopsis of this story is a female apothecary secretly dispenses poisons to liberate women from the men who have wronged them, setting 3 lives across centuries on a dangerous collision course. Rule number 1, the poison must must never be used to harm another woman. Rule number 2, the names of the murderer and her victim must be recorded in the apothecary's register. One cold February evening in 1791, at the back of a dark London alley in a hidden apothecary shop, Nella awaits her newest customer. Once a respected healer, Nella now uses her knowledge for a darker purpose, selling well-disguised poisons to desperate women who will kill to be free of the men in their lives. But when her new patron turns out to be a precocious 12-year-old named Eliza Fanning, an unexpected friendship sets in motion a string of events that jeopardizes Nella's world and threatens to expose the many women whose names are written in her register. Present-day London aspiring historian Caroline Parswell spends her 10th wedding anniversary alone, reeling from the discovery of her husband's infidelity. When she finds an old apothecary vial near the river Thames, she can't resist investigating, only to realize she's found a link to an unsolved apothecary murders that haunted London over 2 centuries ago. As she deepens her search, Caroline's life collides with Nella and Eliza's in a stunning twist of fate, and not everyone will survive. This book was so fun to read. I went in this with the perfect expectation. I just wanted to have a fun time reading about this lost apothecary from 18th century London and follow some really amazing women and how they shaped their lives, each other's lives, and how this lost apothecary kind of shaped them. I loved this. I thought the pacing was very well done with this story. I think each of these characters did the story justice. I think it needed to be told from these 3 women's perspectives, and I thought that it was just so well done. I was enjoying the story pretty much through the entire thing, but I will say that the ending of this book, I just loved it. It just made this book a 4.5 star for me. I absolutely loved the ending because of how well done the ending was, in my personal opinion. It just made this story probably one of my favorites. I still think about this book and I just think about these characters because I loved them. I loved it. I thought it was just such a fun story. I did mention I had a couple of issues with the story, and it mentioned it in the synopsis. One of the characters had to deal with a cheating husband, and I don't particularly care for reading about that kind of stuff, but that's my own fault for going into a book and maybe not researching enough that that is literally in the synopsis. I just wanted to note that. That's kind of why I took off half a star, but I thought that this was just brilliant. This next book, I don't really have too much to say about it because it was a DNF for me. I was so disappointed in this book, and I'm so sad that I had to just stop reading it because I just wasn't loving it. So the book I am talking about is Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. The synopsis of this story says, in a lonely cottage overlooking the windswept Maine coast, Wilder Harlow begins the last book he will ever write. It is a story of his childhood summer companions and the killer that stalked the small New England town, of the body they found and the horror of that discovery echoing down the decades, and of Skye, Wilder's one-time best friend who stole his unfinished memoir and turned it into a lurid, best-selling novel, Looking Glass Sound. But as Wilder writes, the lines between memory and fiction blur. He fears he's losing his grip on reality when he finds notes hidden around the cottage written in Skye's signature green ink. Catriona Ward delivers another mind-bending and cleverly crafted tale about one man's struggle to come to terms with the terrors of his past before it's too late. I DNF'd this book, like I said, because I could not get into the writing style of this story. It was odd. It was just not what I was expecting. I was so disappointed, and I did not connect to Wilder, who is telling the story. I did not like any of his little sidekicks, anybody that we had met in this story so far. I promise I won't spoil anything, but I was reading some reviews of this book, and some people were saying that it all ties in at the end, and I just couldn't hang in there to get to the end of this book. This was just one of those stories for me where I felt like I could read for 2 hours of this book and I didn't remember anything. It was just going in one ear, out the other, but I just felt like I was never getting closer to being finished with this book. I just felt like, oh, I read 2 hours, but then Libby was only telling me I'd read 20 minutes, and I'm like, what the hell? I couldn't read this story, and I was so upset about it. I listened to the audiobook on Libby. I had the ebook on my Kindle, and I believe I had pre-ordered that book, and I ended up just deleting it off of my Kindle. I'm never gonna reread it, and it's so unfortunate. The next book I want to talk about is Gallant by V.E. Schwab. So Gallant follows a young girl named Olivia Pryor who wondered who she truly is and where she belongs. And her only clue is a slim, battered journal. It's her mother's journal full of entries that seem to show that her mother was unraveling, and there are drawings that look like blots of ink until Olivia notices a hand, a door, a bloom, and a skull. And then there's a letter that beckons Olivia home to Gallant. Interesting, weird things start happening around Gallant and surrounding Olivia. This book, I would say, was probably not my favorite V.E. Schwab's book. I had a lot of issues with this book, mainly because I just couldn't connect to any of the characters. I felt like you had the plot of the story, but the plot moved your characters along, and your characters only reacted when something in the plot moved, and they weren't necessarily moving the plot. It was a very odd book. I originally thought that this book was pitched as adult. I was a little confused when I went into this expecting more of an adult story, but it honestly makes me feel like this could be middle grade or YA. This book was very interesting. Now, there are some illustrations in this book that are absolutely beautiful. I do think if you read this book, you should read the physical copy because there's a lot of illustrations. I mean, the pacing was fine with this story. It was a pretty quick read. It was honestly just middle of the road for me, so I would give it 3 stars. It was nothing to write home about by any means, and it was just an okay story. I do truly believe that V.E. Schwab's writing saved this story, and if V.E. Schwab was not as fantastic as she is as being a wordsmith, I probably would have DNF'd this. That's all I have to say about this one. The next book up is Beren and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien. This book I read with Brie Bonomo. She and I have a little book club where right now we're reading all of Tolkien's work. At the beginning of the year, we read The Silmarillion, and it had Beren and Luthien in The Silmarillion, and that was one of my favorite tales within The Silmarillion. When we started to read Beren and Luthien, I loved it. I had a lot of fun with this. It's a pretty quick read. The audiobook for this I would recommend too because it was beautifully done, and I loved that this had a little bit of history with Tolkien and his son creating Beren and Luthien. I thought that this was very sweet. Like I said, it was my favorite story in the Silmarillion, and it's probably my favorite pre-Lord of the Rings book. I think it's absolutely adorable, and it's a 5-star read for me. The next book up, which was also a library book, is Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. The synopsis of this book says, "This is a world divided by blood, red or silver. The Reds are commoners ruled by the silver elite in possession of godlike superpowers. And to Mare Barrow, a 17-year-old red girl from the poverty-stricken stilts, it seems like nothing will ever change. That is until she finds herself working in the Silver Palace. Here, surrounded by the people she hates the most, Mare discovers that, despite her red blood, she possesses a deadly power of her own, one that threatens to destroy the balance of power. Fearful of Mare's potential, the Silvers hide her in plain view, declaring her a long-lost Silver Princess, now engaged to the Silver Prince. Despite knowing that one misstep could mean her death, Mare works silently to help the Red Guard, a militant resistance group, and bring down the Silver regime. But this is a world of betrayal and lies, and Mare has entered a dangerous dance. Reds against Silvers, Prince against Prince, and Mare against her own heart." I had to restart this book because I, for some reason, just could not connect to this this book. When I was listening to the audiobook and trying to follow along, it was just in one ear and out the other. So I had to take a break from reading this book. This book to me is very YA. It read extremely young. If I had read this book about 10 years ago or even in my early 20s, I would have loved this book. I just don't think I was the target audience for it. I did finish it because it's also a buddy read with my buddy Brie Bonomo. I do know I read a few places where this author, Victoria Aveyard, this was the first story she wrote. I know it was the first story she got published, I believe. And she wrote it when she was in her late teens or maybe even early 20s. And I do think it shows. I am very interested in continuing on and giving this author another shot in her other series, Realmbreaker, but I will not continue this series. Alright, we're nearing the end. I have two more, but the next one up is The Tattooist of Auschwitz by Heather Morris. It's a powerful true story of love and survival. I looked this book up online and it calls it a historical fiction, but here it says that it's based off of a true story. I get funny about me star rating nonfiction, so I'm gonna err on the side of caution and I'm not going to rate this book. I mean, I could talk about the writing and I could talk about the characters and all of that, but the thing is this is true. These are true events, and while some reviews I've read say that there are some historical inaccuracies, I have no idea what they are about certain things that happen in here. I just don't feel right in myself star rating somebody else's trauma and somebody else's survival of a very horrible situation. So I'm only going to read the synopsis of this. I would just recommend looking up the trigger warnings and looking up what this story is, and if you think it's something that you would like to read, I would recommend it after you look up the trigger warnings and if you think it's something you can handle. In April 1942, Lale, a Slovakian Jew, is forcibly transported to the concentration camps at Auschwitz. When his captors discovered he speaks several languages, he is put to work as a Tätowierer, the German word for tattooist, tasked with permanently marking his fellow prisoners. Imprisoned for more than 2.5 years, Lale witnesses horrific atrocities, but also incredible acts of bravery and compassion. Risking his own life, he uses his privileged position to exchange jewels and money from murdered Jews for food to keep his fellow prisoners alive. One day in July 1942, Lale, prisoner 32407, comforts a trembling young woman waiting in line to have the number 34902 tattooed on her arm. Her name is Gita, and at first encounter, Lale vows to somehow survive the camp and marry her. A vivid, harrowing, and ultimately hopeful recreation of Lale's experiences as the man who tattooed the arms of thousands of prisoners with what would become the most potent symbols of the Holocaust. The Tattooist of Auschwitz is also a testament to the endearment of love and humanity under the darkest conditions possible. So like I said, I don't feel comfortable giving it a review, giving it a star rating, with it being based off of true events, a true story of this man's life. The last book I want to talk about today is A Flicker in the Dark by Stacy Willingham. I read this book on my Kindle and listened to the audiobook. The synopsis says, when Chloe Davis was 12, 6 teenage girls went missing in her small Louisiana town. By the end of the summer, Chloe's father had been arrested as a serial killer and promptly put in prison. Chloe and the rest of her family were left to grapple with the truth and try to move forward while dealing with the aftermath. Now, 20 years later, Chloe is a psychologist in private practice in Baton Rouge and getting ready for her wedding. She finally has a fragile grasp on the happiness she's worked so hard to get. Sometimes, though, she feels as out of control of her life as the troubled teens who are her patients. And then a local teenage girl goes missing, and then another. And the terrifying summer comes crashing back. Is she paranoid and seeing parallels that aren't really there? Or for the second time in her life, is she about to unmask a killer? This is Stacy Willingham's debut novel, and I just want to say, for a debut, you, this was so freaking good. I loved this book. The writing in this book is addictive. I could not get enough while I was reading this book. I think that our main character, Chloe Davis, was a very well fleshed out character. From my perspective, the author did a very great job of capturing the trauma that this character felt as a child and how she was dealing with it as an adult. I really did love this book. Did I feel like it was a little predictable? Did I call some of the twists and turns? Yes. I did, but it did not take away from my experience of this book. I can look past all of that. I read this book so quickly and it was so fun. I loved this book so much. I am giving it 5 stars. I thought this was just so fun and just an all-around great book, and I will be reading more from this author. I think she just has great ways of structuring her sentences, and I think a lot of the issues that this author addressed and talked about in these books was very well done and presented in a very relatable way. A lot of these characters were relatable. I do think some of the things that happened in here, you have to use a little bit of your imagination. I think if you look too far into it and you try to nitpick too much, you won't enjoy this book. But I went into it just wanting to have fun, and I'm not saying I had low expectations, but I went into this really not knowing a whole heck of a lot and just had fun with it. That is what I recommend. I recommend just going in this wanting a good time. You're gonna have a great time. I think this book would honestly make a really fantastic movie adaptation. I think it would be really fun and I would totally watch it. But overall, I think it was a really fast-paced, fun thriller. That is my reading wrap up for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know a book that you have read recently, a 5-star read, a book you've DNF'd, a book that was middle of the road for you. Let me know any of that fun, exciting reading information, because I would absolutely love to know what you're reading right now. If you've read any of the books I've mentioned here today, definitely let me know. But that is going to be it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Autumn and I will see you in the next one. Bye.